Welcome to a webinar about Dicamba. I'm Dan Scheinman. I'm the Bird Conservation Director for Audubon, Arkansas. I'm the host of this webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and I will share a link with the CDN shortly after the conclusion of this webinar, so you can pass it on to colleagues who are unable to attend. Everyone is on mute until the end of the webinar, when we will have a Q&A session. So this is about Dicamba. Dicamba is an herbicide. It's also an emerging agricultural and conservation issue. It is controversial, but this webinar is merely educational for all of you who manage land and who work with private landowners. It's to help you learn to identify Dicamba symptomology on native vegetation so that you can properly manage your land, and so you can help any landowners that might have questions about that. And we'll also tell you how to report any Dicamba symptomology. To help us with that today, I have Ford Baldwin, who is an herbicide specialist, and I will let him take it away from here.
Okay. I appreciate the opportunity. I'll give a little bit of introduction about myself as we go. And I thought, since this was kind of a first time, I'd spend some of the talk. I mean, I want to get this thing done in 30 minutes or less. Dan has admonished me to be concise. I try to let my visuals do most of the talking for me as we go through those. I could have named this a lot of different things: potential for off-target damage or concern about off-target damage, and we can talk about some of those things as we go. Just a little bit about myself, and I don't talk much about myself, but I came to the University of Arkansas right out of my PhD program in 1974, and was on the faculty as an extension weed scientist working. Worked a lot of things when I first started, but over time narrowed my program pretty much down to soybean and rice weed control. I had a pretty extensive applied research and education program in that area. I retired from the university in 2002, and since that time I have just been working in the private sector as a consultant, doing quite a few things. I mean, I'll tell you up front, I've always been a rice soybean guy. I've always been involved in big agriculture. And when this technology that we're going to talk about came along, I would normally been out front telling our farmers, look, I mean, here's a new technology. This is something we need to embrace and we need to go forward with. Unfortunately, it has some issues that a scientist just simply can't overlook, and that's what we'll get into today. I'm certainly not a tree expert. In fact, I'll probably misidentify some of the things I've got on my slides. You can laugh at me if I got that tree wrong or that plant wrong or whatever, but the herbicide symptomology that we're going to talk about a little bit later will kind of speak for itself. You think I'd be better off with the buttons, down button? Okay. Hang on, let me make sure I'm on the right one. Okay, just a little bit about the objectives, and Dan touched on that. I'm mainly just here from an educational standpoint and try to create some awareness, perhaps raise a level of concern, but I'm certainly not here to create panic or anger. I'm not here to send anybody on a witch hunt. And quite honestly, I hope I'm wrong on a lot of things. Science is kind of playing catch up on this issue, and I would love to look back on this and know that I had been wrong on some of the things we're going to talk about. First, just a little bit about the herbicide. What is Dicamba as a herbicide? It belongs in the group of herbicides that weed scientists would call group 4s, or it's a synthetic auxin. It was first registered in 1967. So you say, well, man, it's been around all these years. All of a sudden, why is it at issue now? It works in the plant by mimicking natural plant auxin or indole acetic acid. The difference is plants can control their level of IAA They're unable to often control the level of a growth regulator type herbicide like Dicamba. And so they are referred to as growth regulators, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. There's a large class of herbicides in the group 4s. Dicamba is one of them, one that more people are probably more familiar with than Dicamba would be 2,4-D. But there are also a lot of other growth regulators in this class of chemistry. If you look at the class of chemistry as a whole, they're active on a wide range of dicot plants. They're excellent broadleaf herbicides. Most of them are. Dicamba certainly is, with grass selectivity. So what that means is you can control broadleaf weeds and grass crops with them, whether that be pasture or corn or grain sorghum or rice or whatever. That's primarily what they've been used for. Another thing that sets them apart, they're extremely active at extremely low dose rates, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later, but because they are so active at such low dose rates, then because of this, their off-target issues with this group of herbicides have been common. 2,4-D came out in the late 1940s and had all kind of drift issues on cotton, spraying rice and other crops with the 2,4-D, back especially when we were using ester formulations and a lot of volatility issues. And so we're kind of going through some of that same type of learning curve again with Dicamba. You know, another auxin herbicide, type herbicide that we've had some issues with in Arkansas has been a rice herbicide called quinflorac that is extremely active on tomatoes. And so, you know, we've had experiences. We've learned how to work our way through them most of the time and find some common ground. I just put you a little example in here on the type of activity that the auxins can have. Everyone's pretty familiar with the herbicide Roundup. Of course, it's been in the news a lot lately. But corn and seedling corn and seedling rice are extremely sensitive to Roundup herbicide. But even at that, it takes about a 1% of a normal use rate to damage those crops. If you moved into Dicamba, it takes about a 0.005%, or a 1% would be 1 in 100, and or 1/100th of a rate. If you go to a 0.05% or lower, Dicamba is active on some plants like soybean. It rates as low as 1/10,000th or even 1/20,000th of an X rate. So that means it doesn't take near as much of it moving off target to cause damage issues. People ask me all the time, why does this herbicide drift so much worse than that one? May not be drifting any worse at all. It just doesn't take near as much of it getting to an off-target plant or group of plants to potentially cause damage. What are the traditional uses of Dicamba been? Touched on that a little bit, but the first registrations back in the late 60s, early 70s were on corn and grain sorghum. Then on small grains, pasture and range land, turf, non-crop areas. You can actually go to the garden center or Walmart and buy herbicides for lawn use and home use that contain Dicamba in them. And so that's the way we started out using the herbicide and used it all of these years that way. And with those uses, off-target issues were just pretty rare. I mean, people want to know, you know, why now? But when you look at the traditional uses of Dicamba that I just went through, one, you had very wide application windows. The uses were very spread out over the growing season or over the calendar. The treated acres were spread out. You weren't treating landscape acres with Dicamba on those crops, so to speak. And we're gonna contrast that in a minute. But and then most of those applications by nature were sprayed during cool periods in the spring and fall. And so if you prior to say 2015 or 16, if you just look at the traditional uses of dicamba, there have been very few off-target complaints. And don't quote me on these numbers, but I'm thinking over the last 10 years prior to 2016 in Arkansas, our plant board had like 14 total. Other states were as low as 0, or maybe 5 or 6 complaints a year, or over a 10-year period for that matter. So again, what changed? Why are we here? So what's changed has been the introduction of dicamba tolerant, or out in the marketplace, they're known as Roundup Extend, cotton and soybean. Cotton was first introduced in 2015. The soybeans were introduced in 2016. Neither of those years was there a registration to spray dicamba on them. Some of that happened anyway, but then the new formulations got labeled in 2017 by the EPA to be sprayed over the top of the Roundup Extend cotton and soybean crops. So if you look at Arkansas, we were starting to have issues in 2016. Arkansas, the Boot Heel of Missouri, West Tennessee had quite a few off-target issues in 2016 just due to illegal use. But 2017, then those issues became much more widespread nationwide as the herbicide started being used in other parts of the country. So why dicamba crops? Why did we need the dicamba tolerant or the extend crops? If you go back to the mid-1990s, I mean, of course, I came up through the herbicide era, the herbicide boom, so to speak, starting in the late 60s, early 70s. But the miracle breakthrough in selective weed control and agronomic crops came in the mid-1990s with the Roundup Ready technology. And I'm sure I don't know who all I'm talking to out there, but most of you have heard of Roundup Ready soybean, Roundup Ready cotton, Roundup Ready corn. And a lot of people have equated that technology somewhat to penicillin in medicine. Just one of those 1 in 100-year discoveries that was truly a miracle. And for a 10-year period, basically what it did to me, it made a rice weed scientist out of me, because there was no Roundup Ready rice. And for a 10-year period, once Roundup Ready came on the market, you just didn't need a weed guy in those crops. You just sprayed Roundup a couple of 3 times a year. The field was clean, and everything was lovely. But about 2005, that technology began to fail from a herbicide resistance standpoint. Along about 2005, we just started noticing scattered weeds in fields that had always been clean the prior several years. Didn't think as much about it as we probably should have. 2006, along in there, we started seeing spots in fields. 2007, we started seeing streaks in fields. And then by about 2008 or 9, we had fields that weren't having harvesters put in them because of a weed called Palmer amaranth. I mean, the Roundup Ready technology failed that quickly, and some of the remedial action that we took because of that failed very quickly as well. So you fast forward to now, and farmers are just left with major weed issues and very few herbicide options. There hasn't been a new herbicide mode of action developed in the last 30 or 35 years. And so we've tried to prop that up by engineering crops to tolerate herbicides that we already had, like Roundup, or now like Dicamba and some others. But farmers just don't have a lot of post-emergent herbicides or options right now. I mean, if you have Palmer amaranth or pigweed in cotton and soybean that's resistant to Roundup and these other herbicides, you really only have about 2 options left, and one of them is Dicamba. And it's very effective on what we're calling the primary driver weeds. Those are the ones that if you don't kill them, nothing else matters. And so in Arkansas, that would be Palmer amaranth. If you move to the Midwest, it would be a kissing cousin of Palmer amaranth called water hemp. So that's the reason for the need for the technology. and it's been very, very rapidly adopted because it is very effective on those target weeds. And I put in here that the predictions are for 60% or more of the cotton and soybean acres in 2019, but that's nationwide. In Arkansas, I think a conservative estimate of our acres would be probably 80 or 85% of our cotton and soybean will be planted to this Extend technology. So that means you're going to have a huge number of acres out there that are going to be sprayed at least once and more likely twice with Dicamba. When you look at the windows of application on cotton and soybean, you got to spray pigweed with this herbicide before they're more than about 4 to 6 inches tall. So that makes for very narrow timing windows. That's going to be even exasperated this year because we're so far behind on planting, and we'll touch on that just a little bit as we finish. But our planting season is getting very, very compressed. And so that means when the weather finally breaks, everybody's going to plant at the same time. And that means all the Dicamba is going to be being sprayed at the same time. And also in cotton and soybean, then you're spraying in much higher temperatures than we've traditionally sprayed in corn or small grains or some of these other uses. That's going to be exasperated this year as well because our planting season is getting pushed back even further. So we may well be spraying a lot of Dicamba this year in temperatures that are 5 to 10 degrees higher than they would have been had we got to plant at normal times this spring. And then where that comes into effect is Dicamba, one of the Achilles heels with it is it's volatile. And by volatile, that means it can turn from a solid or a liquid to a gas and move off in a gaseous form. And the two new herbicides that were developed for use in these crops were developed as lower volatility formulations, but low volatility doesn't mean no volatility. And what we're finding is that they're just not enough lower in volatility to prevent some of the issues like we were hoping that they would. And you say, okay, well, are other herbicides volatile? I mean, I told you a little bit before about the 2,4-D back in the day on cotton, and they developed a non-volatile 2,4-D that solved a lot of that issue. A lot of the other volatile herbicides we've used through the years, we've been able to, some of them have been incorporated in the soil, for example, or applied in ways that you could reduce the volatility. But most post-emergence herbicides by nature are just not volatile. And so when they're not volatile, the main issue you have off target is simply physical drift. But in the case of Dicamba, it has a volatility component to it. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of the other scientists, that's what's causing our major off-target issues. So to kind of summarize that part of the thing up, major issues, I mean, we knew starting back, I was writing Delta Farm Press articles as early as 2011, that there's no way we were going to be able to intercrop Dicamba tolerant crops and non-Dicamba tolerant soybean. I mean, I simply knew from past experience that would not work. So the major issues that we've had on non-Dicamba tolerant soybean was anticipated. And there's starting about 2017 and into 2018, you've had a record number of herbicide complaints nationwide. I mean, it has swamped most of the regulatory agencies in those states. Far exceeded issues with anything we've ever experienced before, from off-target issues. Arkansas set the curve on number of off-target complaints with Dicamba in 2017, round numbers 1,000. You know, most years the plant board will get less than 100 complaints on everything put together, and in 2017 they had right at 1,000 Dicamba complaints. They went into an emergency rule and stopped the use of it in 2017 in July. We were the only state in the nation that stopped the use mid-season that year. Actually, Missouri did too, but they put it back in roughly a week later. In 2018, our plant board, we had an April 16th cutoff. And so that greatly reduced the number of complaints that we had in 2018. I think there were a couple of hundred, and most of those were the result of people that ignored the cutoff. If everybody had followed the cutoff, we would have probably had no complaints in 2018. Dicamba symptomology. I mean, what does it look like on plants? The telltale or fingerprint symptom is going to be leaf cupping for the most part. Either a lot of plants, it tends to cup the leaves upward. We'll look at some examples as we go through this where it can also cup the leaves downward. Twisting and curling of the stems and petioles or epinasty. Then as you get to higher rate, chlorosis out in the growing points, growth malformation, all kind of growth malformations, including reproductive growth malformation. And I think that's what's causing some of the issue on some of the forbs and the pollinator plants, is it doesn't take a lot of change in morphology on flowers and things to affect some of the pollinators. You know, you hear a lot of stories on pecan and things that where, you know, it didn't affect the foliage that much, but they just didn't make a pecan crop. Biomass reduction, and we'll look at that a little bit. And then as you get to higher rates and more extreme cases, wilting, necrosis, and death. But at the kind of off-target drift rates we're looking at, most of the symptoms are going to be cupping, twisting, that kind of thing. And you know, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, you know, all auxin herbicides can cup. Yeah, that's true, but you got to look at what is the primary symptom as opposed to what may just be a secondary symptom or what have you. Just threw an example of soybean in here. In that picture, the two rows of soybean on the left were non-dicamba soybeans. The soybean starting at that red flag and the rows on the right side of the picture was extend soybean, and a drift of dicamba or just an air mass load of dicamba had moved across that field. And so it just kind of give you a little bit of idea of the symptomology. Biomass reduction, you can see the height reduction, more space between in the canopy, as well as some of the cupping on the leaves. This would be a lower dose type scenario on soybean, but again, what do you see? The primary symptom there is upcupping, very characteristic upcupping of the leaves, and in some case some stem epinasty. And you know, you'll hear people say, well, they grow right out of that and it doesn't hurt the yield. There's a more extreme case. That farmer had averaged 75 bushel per acre. That field had a field average of 75 bushel per acre. The past 2 years, it cut 20 bushel per acre that year. That was one of the more extreme drift cases that I saw in 2017. So the soybean issue was anticipated. That was not a big surprise to anybody. I had been writing about it for 5 years before it came out, saying, you know, in my opinion, I thought it could be the worst train wreck that agriculture had ever seen. What happened in 2017, the landscape, the magnitude and the landscape effect, and by landscape, I mean just very widespread uniform symptoms. I mean, if you drove eastern Arkansas, West Tennessee, the Boot Heel of Missouri, and from the middle of June to the middle of July, just essentially every non-dicamba soybean field that you looked at had essentially the same level of symptomology. They were all affected, and there were no patterns in them. They were just uniformly affected from side to side and end to end. And but even at that, I would have to admit it even exceeded, I think, some of our worst expectations. What we didn't anticipate was the effect on trees and native vegetation. I think that one has caught a lot of people off guard. It certainly caught me off guard. And I got involved in looking at a lot of soybean fields in the Boot Heel of Missouri in 2016. And the thing that just jumped out at me was the effect on trees and native vegetation. I had not seen that ever before with 2,4-D or widespread with any other auxin herbicide. And so that was kind of my first introduction into what we're seeing today. So I'm just going to show you a few examples now of symptomology out in the landscape and some of the kinds of things you can be looking for. And they'll have training materials and things on this. These pictures will kind of run together. This is sycamore, and sycamore kind of tends to set the curve for sensitivity, in my opinion, on tree species. You know, the thing you see there, one is the upcupping. You also do see some chlorosis there. Part of that's just because when they cup up, you're looking at the bottom side of the leaves with it that can tend to be a lighter color. Another example of sycamore, upcupping, downcupping. The interesting thing about this tree and several others that were in the same general area, they had been hit pretty hard in 2017, but the farmers in the area around these trees had abided by the plant board cutoff in 2018, and everybody says that no dicamba was sprayed in that entire general area up there, and yet these trees were showing relatively the same level of symptomology that they were showing the year before. Now, how much of that's going to hold true? I mean, we're still in a learning curve here, but that is a concern, I think, that's got to be addressed. I have no idea what this is. It just happened to be growing at downtown Crawfordsville, Arkansas. So, I mean, it would be a half a mile to a mile at least from any dicamba applications that were made. And, you know, you can't see a lot of the specific, but you can look in the top of it and tell that the leaves are all malformed and the top growth is all malformed. And I like this one. Happened to be a catalpa plant growing in a peach orchard that I've been involved in. We've also learned that peach is very sensitive to the herbicide, but I'm a wine drinker, and I tell a lot of people that every one of those catalpa upcup leaves, you could put a half a glass of wine in. Just very, very characteristic upcupping. I believe this is a cherry or some type of wild cherry. It's in a yard in Marble, Arkansas, and there's a little bit closer up. And that's a species where you got a much better example of epinasty than you have so much cupping that we're seeing on some of the other trees. But all of that curling and epinasty of the petiole can be pretty characteristic. Oaks tend to cup the other way, and there's one example of an oak, maybe white oak. I can't tell all of my oak trees apart. White oak tends to be more sensitive of the oaks. The other thing you see in that picture, as you look up through the canopy in the tree, that tree or the tree in the background, you see a much more open canopy than you would expect. And that gets into the biomass reduction, and that's one of the things that Lou Nelms in Illinois, and I think some of y'all have probably seen his videos and pictures, but that's one of the things you'll hear him talk about is he just noticed a much more open, yellower looking canopy in a lot of these trees in addition to that down cupping. This is a better example right here, but some people are calling the downward cupping a cobra head effect or a boxing glove effect, pretty characteristic. But again, as you look up through the canopy in this grove of trees here, those trees were hit pretty hard, and you just notice a much more open canopy there. This is a bramble of some kind, and if you just looked at that by itself, those other pictures are mine. The next couple of three pictures are not, and I mean I can't even look for sure and tell you that is dicamba. I can tell you it's a growth regulator herbicide, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to drill down on that in a minute. Even on a plant like poison oak, you can see an effect from it, a cupping effect from it there. Don't even know for sure what that one is. And again, I couldn't look at that picture by itself and tell you it was dicamba, but you can look in the terminal there with those strapped out malformed leaves and tell that it's definitely an auxin or a growth regulator herbicide. This is one of my pictures. This is kudzu. And I don't think you could kill kudzu with dicamba if you tried. But notice the cupping on the leaves, and as we get a little bit further away, that kudzu was grown all the way up in the top of a pretty tall tree. And you can just look at it and tell that the leaves are cupped and malformed all up and down the plant. And the other thing about that, you really can't see it in this picture, but it was uniformly affected all the way around. And that's the other thing that we're seeing on a lot of these tree species that tells us we're looking at an air loading effect, is the trees will be uniformly affected from top to bottom and uniformly affected all the way around the tree. Where if you've got a physical drift that's blowing spray particles up against that tree, you'll tend to have much more effect on the windward side of the tree. And we're not seeing that on a lot of the trees that we're seeing out there in the landscape. This happened to be a ginkgo tree. I think that's a ginkgo. It's malformed and messed up to the point you can't hardly tell what it is. And that one is growing in the yard at the experiment station, at the University Experiment Station in Kaiser, Arkansas. And they had a lot of soybeans. In fact, a lot of the researchers' plots got wiped out on that experiment station in 2017 and 2018 both. And it did a pretty good number on the ginkgos as well. The plant board, and this just isn't me out there. You got a lot of the university guys. Some of you may have heard Dr. Jason Norsworthy speak before, but he talks about this a lot. But the plant board actually hired a scientist from Mississippi as an independent, out-of-state person to come over and assist some of our plant board inspectors to drill down on what they were seeing, further train them on what could be dicamba, might not be dicamba out in the field. And he made several trips to eastern Arkansas and from the period from starting in late July kind of through late August. And I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. He has a report that Dan has a copy of, but he basically said when you got over in the high use dicamba areas, that you could see dicamba-like symptomology prevalent on the trees in pretty much every city, town, and community visited. He also made the comment that you could pretty much see dicamba symptoms on any non-dicamba tolerant soybean field in that general area. And he listed the ones I have at the bottom: Bradford pear, cherry, sycamore, maple, cypress, and white oak, as being some of the more sensitive that he's seen. And there's some other lists out there as well. Kevin Bradley from the University of Missouri is starting to look at dicamba on more tree and shrub species as well. So there's some other lists out there. This isn't an all-inclusive one by any means. So why is the damage so widespread and so uniform? And that widespread uniform effect is what I'm calling a landscape effect, and it's primarily due to atmospheric loading, in my opinion, taking place in temperature inversions. If you get physical drift that's just blowing from my field to my neighbor's field across the road, it's usually going to leave a pattern. There'll be a gradient in the level of symptomology across the field. There'll be, if there's protected areas, some of the field goes in behind a wood line, or something like that, you'll be able to pick those patterns out. Volatility patterns are much more subtle, but drift is the movement of physical spray particles coming out of the sprayer, what we would call primary movement. They blow out and blow off and blow away somewhere and affect something else, where volatility is happening after the spray is physically on the target area. The herbicide is tending to, well, it didn't tending, is turn into a gas and move it off in vapor form. And the research now is showing that volatility can take place over a 72 to 96 hour period. So what that means is, if you're an applicator, you can go out there and do everything right, making the application to the field that you're spraying, and yet the herbicide still move off target 2 or 3 or 4 days later to something that's no fault of your own. And when you look at the magnitude of it, and we just go down, those of us that are trained to looked at this stuff for 45 years, you just pretty much know that it's taking an atmospheric loading of aerosols and volatiles, primarily hanging up in temperature inversions, that primarily nighttime inversions, that trap this stuff and hold it over an area and let it move in mass laterally across large areas, as opposed to exhausting out in the atmosphere like it normally would. The other thing that's happening out there is we're not looking at single events or single exposures. We're looking at multiple exposures, repeated exposures, sometimes continuous exposure. You get this stuff hung up in a temperature inversion. It hangs over an area all night long. Those plants are getting some constant exposure to dicamba as opposed to a one-time hit. And then I think another reason we're here today is the difference in effect on annual plants versus perennials. The effect on soybeans, whether it reduces the yield or doesn't reduce the yield or whatever, that's a one-time thing. That's over. Anything that soybeans that get injured in 2019, that's over at the end of 2019. But what we're seeing with perennial plants, and what our concern is with perennials, is they're getting exposed over multiple years, multiple times over multiple years. And I'm one that believes there's going to be a cumulative effect to that. And that's one of my major concerns about what we're seeing out there on the trees and some of the other plants. So, if you're trying to figure out what's going on, or you see something and you see plants that don't look right, and you want to try to figure out, okay, am I looking at dicamba or some other type of auxin herbicide? What are some of the things you can do? And hopefully somebody will get some better materials and hand out material on this. But first place, all auxin-like symptomology may not be caused by dicamba. I mean, if somebody's spraying 2,4-D or some other auxin out there, and that happened to be what hit the plants that you're looking at, then that can give you auxin-type symptomology. The other thing is, make sure the symptoms are being caused by herbicide, because there are some things that can mimic sometimes. I mean, some different diseases and even insect damage and things could be confusing until you learn how to separate those. Symptomology on an individual plant can be caused by a lot of things, but start looking for patterns. I mean, when you see an individual plant that doesn't look right, start looking for patterns and start looking beyond that individual plant. I mean, non-herbicide symptoms are not likely to be widespread or across species. I mean, let's say it was a disease problem or an insect problem. It's not likely going to be affecting sycamore and oak and cherry and some of the other forbs straight across the board. So that's a pretty good indication. Is there an obvious point source nearby? I mean, is there a sprayed field that you can pretty much look at and just say, hey, it came from right over there? All plants, are the plants affected on one side, or are they affected uniform? If they're affected on one side, it may be a physical drift. If they're affected very uniformly and over a widespread area, then it's obviously going to be an atmospheric loading effect, probably from dicamba, and that's going to coincide with major spray dates. And normally about 14 days after the major spraying starts to take place. And obviously that hadn't happened yet, but it's going to be widespread, it's going to be uniform, and it's going to be across a range of species. If you're looking at oak trees that don't look right, try to find a sycamore, try to find a cherry. Just look at different species, a Bradford pear, those kinds of things. Sources of help. You think you see something, you think you got an issue, you're not sure, who can you call to help you? The Extension Service, for one. I mean, you can go through the county agent. They've got excellent specialists that can help. University weed scientists can help. I'll help when I can. I make my living now in the private sector, but I'm willing to volunteer all of my time that I possibly can. And then I know some of y'all are in agencies, and I'm sure within your own agencies, you're going to have some expertise, or you're going to train some expertise to be able to do that as well. But all I'm saying is there are people out there that can help you. What about reporting? You see that you think something's going on, you want to go a step further. Who do you report to? And you know, the people that are in charge of off-target herbicide issues are the Arkansas State Plant Board. And I put one number up here, probably ask for somebody in the pesticide division, but they will send an inspector, and depending on how many complaints they're getting at one time, how quickly they can respond. We have the best plant board in the country, in my opinion, or best regulatory agency in the country. And they will come out and they'll look, and you know, if you choose to file a complaint, you can file a complaint. They'll take your information. If they feel like they need help, then they'll go get help. And I want to kind of be careful here, because I'm not just drumming up and beating the tubs to let's go out and, you know, see how many complaints that we can get. I mean, I pointed out earlier, my purpose here is not to send you on a witch hunt. But the flip side of that is, if there are a lot of issues going on out there and people aren't reporting them, the plant board has no record of it. Their only record of what's going on out in the state is how many complaints that they're getting. And so if you know, if we've seen 1,000 complaints out there and only 20 of them get reported, then their attitude is going to be, well, we didn't get the 20 complaints, so we just don't see how it's an issue, and there's nothing we can act on. So I guess what I'm saying, there's a common sense kind of middle of the ground there, but if they don't find out about it, then they're not going to know that it happened. Just last slide here, I think, or close to the last one, is our current situation. What the plant board did this year is implemented a May 25th cutoff of dicamba, all dicamba spread and extend crops. Now, in addition to that, there are some buffers as well. There's like a mile buffer around university and USDA experiment stations. There's a mile buffer around certified organic crops. I think there's a half-mile buffer around pretty much anything deemed to be susceptible on like the Ingenia dicamba label. So, and I didn't try to list all of that here. Kind of the thinking was, if everybody had abided by the April 16th cutoff last year, then we shouldn't have had any complaints to speak of. So could we extend that some and maybe find a compromise that would let the farmers utilize the technology to an extent and avoid getting some help here? And yet avoid a lot of the off-target issues. The problem with that is, right now there's very little cotton and soybean planted. So if we started planting today, May 25th is what, 9 days from now. So there's just not going to be any spraying going on to speak of. So what does that mean? Some people are probably, I know they're already getting phone calls asking for an emergency rule to extend that deadline. Well, you know, if we do that, that kind of defeats the purpose of not spraying in the hottest temperatures. Most of the farmers in Arkansas are committed to this extend technology. That's the seed they've planted. So, you know, if they ask for a deadline, whether the plant board will meet and try to implement an emergency rule or not, I have no opinion on that. Will farmers just choose to spray anyway? You know, maybe they will, maybe they won't. Some will, some won't probably. But I will say this, it's ugly in agriculture right now. Farmers have their backs against the wall. A lot of them, if this thing doesn't turn around almost immediately, they're fighting for their livelihood. And when that happens, then, you know, all of us by nature, sometimes we don't make the most logical and rational decisions that we can make. So I think by the spray date's going to probably get pushed back one way or the other into hotter, higher temperatures. and then all of this thing getting jammed up together, and then people getting in a panic and maybe not using the best judgment. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm just afraid we could have maybe the worst year we've had to date, probably nationwide. Long-term concerns, tree decline for one thing, and I'm not an expert on that, but I have been reading a little bit about it. And you know, when trees get exposed to a pollutant or different types of things over a period of time, that enables diseases, insects, other things to come in that may get the blame, but may not be the most obvious source. That's a concern of mine. Effect on pollinator plants, and Dave Mortensen is an excellent expert in that area. He was raising red flags on that 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, and has published quite a bit of stuff on it. And I think Dan is getting some of that together. Big concern in the bee industry. You know, a lot of opinions there both ways, but I'm convinced that there is an effect on the pollinator plants out there that is affecting the bee industry, and then the monitoring thing, and I think Dan's going to talk some more about that. But you know, just how do we monitor? How do we keep an eye on what's going on out there, and you know, see what's happening? And I think with that, we'll go to the Q&A.
Yep. In just a second, I'm going to unmute everyone's lines so that you can ask questions. Everyone is unmuted. Any questions? Don't be shy.
Dan, this is Steve Brock. Can you hear me?
Sure. Go ahead, Steve.
I was a little late getting on the call. Did y'all talk about at the beginning how this information might be shared out post-presentation in terms of a PDF or a recording or availability of the information you shared?
Yes, sir. This is being recorded right now, and I will share a link with the CDN. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Is there any, has anybody done any work to see if this chemical gets into the fruits of the plants that are affected by it?
Okay, there was quite a bit starting in 2016 when this thing kind of blew up in the boot heel of Missouri first, and there it was affecting vine crops, cucumber, cantaloupe, watermelon, that kind of thing. And then, of course, that's when some of the first effect on peaches started to be documented. And there were a lot of samples pulled, I guess, by FDA and some others, and so far they're not finding any residue right now. Now, a lot of that samples tend to get pulled quite a bit after the fact, and you know, whether if samples were pulled closer to the event, you know, who knows? Maybe it doesn't translocate that much into the fruit. The other thing that is, it's normally going to be at low rates, and I know in foliage, for example, in some of these crops, the plants will detect it and show it at levels you can't find it on a mass spec gas chromatograph. So, you know, sometimes the analytical methods just aren't sensitive enough. But of the plants that have been sampled so far, they have not found it in the edible portions of the plants. But you know, there's a huge catch up here. I mean, a lot of people say, "Why didn't y'all know all of this?" And we never had a reason to learn, because we had never used dicamba on large acreages in the summertime before. So there's just a whole area like this one you just asked about, or what is the long-term effect on trees going to be, or you know, if they've been hit several years and they quit being exposed, will they recover? I mean, what type of concentrations are occurring over time out in some of these areas, and there's just no information out there on it. I mean, it's very frustrating because you see these things, you're pretty confident in what you're seeing. You just have to use your knowledge, training, and experience for a pretty good idea of what's going on. But then when you start going to the literature to try to really prove it, and you can't find anything on it.
Next question.
I got a question. Was it any good? I've given a lot of talks around the country my whole life, but I've never spoke into a black box and had to pretend that was a whole bunch of people out there looking at me.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, this is helpful.
Very, very good.
Yeah, I would
Very
think
good.
I know more now than what I did. I didn't know very much at all, so I kind of know what to look for. That was the whole point of it.
It seems to me, just speaking into the group and to Dan, because he's mentioned before something about a methodology that Audubon was considering developing for kind of citizen science tracking of identified damage. I mean, it seems to me a key part of coming out of this for the conservation community is, identifying and reporting. It sounds like there could be some significant impacts on WMAs and national wildlife refuges and other conservation estate areas. And I guess I'm kind of curious if there is any organized or, what folks' plans are to kind of try to stay on top of this so that the reporting can be accomplished if it's going to be a major conservation concern.
Well, this is Dan Scheinman with Audubon. That's why I have organized this webinar. That's why I'm going to be organizing a citizen science program to look for dicamba on native plants on public lands, because for Audubon, it is ultimately a bird habitat, pollinator habitat issue. And in terms of all the organizations that you represent, I encourage you to talk internally about how you want to aggregate your data and what you want to do with it. And I echo Ford's his request that you contact the plant board if you see something, say something, because probably the number of agricultural complaints, at least soybean, cotton, is certainly going to go down. So the new metric is going to be native plants, by and large, as well as specialty crops, but also native plants, and we are the ones that have to stand up for those native plants because there aren't producers that are growing them.
And I think one thing to add about that too, if you think about traditional off-target issues through the years that we've had with various herbicides, most of them are very close to the application site. I mean, if you think about all the rice fields that we spray with airplanes, I mean, the vegetation right around the edges of the field, get banged up pretty good every year, but that's as far as it goes. I mean, I'm not saying that's good either, but that's as far as it goes, because physical drift just doesn't move that far. It either dilutes, exhausts out, or gets intercepted. But when you get into this air mass loading, like we believe that we're seeing, in fact, I know that's what we're seeing, then when you get an air mass moving through an area, then it's going to move much deeper into a forest canopy or whatever. I mean, I don't know how far it can go and all of that, but if that air mass is loaded and it's moving laterally through there, over the course of the night or the length of the temperature inversion, I mean, it can go a long way. I mean, if you look at atmospheric, a lot of the work that's done on long-range transport of pesticides, I mean, you're talking miles and miles and miles sometimes. And one of the things that we saw in 2017, a lot of these injured soybeans were miles away from the nearest known dicamba application. And we also saw the same thing in trees and towns, and that's one of the things Trey Coger pointed out, that he said, yeah, maybe it got a little less the deeper you went into town or communities or what have you, but you still could find it. And a lot of these are miles away from nearest application sites, and we've just never seen that before. One of my counterparts from Tennessee tells a story. He had been ragged out all week looking at dicamba soybeans. I don't remember whether it was 2016 or 17, but he lives in town in Jackson, Tennessee. And he had come in that afternoon dead to the world, maybe 4th of July or whatever, and put something on the barbecue and got him a beer and sat down in his chair and got to looking around, and he said, he said, the dang trees and the bushes in my own damn yard in the middle of Jackson, Tennessee are showing dicamba symptomology. So that's what's different about this than some of the traditional things that we've dealt with in the past.
Hey, Ford, I got a question.
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, you mentioned that I think May 25th was the cutoff date, and I know how farmers are. I grew up in the Mississippi Delta. I understand them; they'll do whatever it takes. But they're going to have an applicator to put that out. I'm assuming the airplane. Are they not liable for spraying off label or going outside of that date?
Well, there's a liability if it gets enforced. Now, one thing, there is no label for aerial application. I mean, that would really be a train wreck. But a lot of those guys own their own sprayers, and I'm not trying to make them bad guys. I mean, there's definitely a farmer side to this thing, and I'm very sensitive about the farmer side to it. I would normally be the guy throwing the shoulder behind it, saying, hey, this is our next step. This is to get us to the next step. We got to get behind this technology and go. But it's just that I'm a firm believer that herbicides are a wonderful thing when they do their job and they stay where you put them and they don't damage other people or other people's stuff. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's definitely a liability. The legislature implemented they redefined that $25,000 up to $25,000 fine. Now that before it was defined as egregious and you had to prove who did it and prove damage. Well, the good Lord can't tell where a bunch of this stuff comes from because it's so uniform in landscape. And so they changed it now to label violations can be considered to be egregious. So if they don't extend the date and people start violating the deadline, then yes, they are liable if they get caught and the plant board chooses to enforce it. I think the big question will be, how are they going to choose to enforce it? Are they going to go look for people spraying, look for effects of recent sprays like they were doing last year? They even put an airplane in the air a couple of days last year. Or are they strictly going to make it based on complaints? And if they make it based on complaints, to me, that kind of defeats the purpose of a lot of it. So I think, and again, I'm not trying to incite a riot or anything at all, but I think it may be up to some of y'all to ask some hard questions. If it's obvious that people are starting to spray after the deadline, as to what's going to be done about this.
Right. Now, that's what I'm with you. I'm not condemning farmers at all. I love beans and rice myself, but just trying to wrap my head around what kind of the I guess policy is about labeling and who's responsible.
It'll definitely be a label violation. Well, it'll be an Arkansas. It won't be a federal label violation. It'll be an Arkansas State Plant Board violation. Now there can be some other things that could be federal violations. Violating the wind speed, you know, some of those other things too. But the cutoff is a plant board violation. And you know, Dan and I were talking earlier too. West of Crowley's Ridge in southern Arkansas, where you've had a little different crop rotation, and the Palmer amaranth situation is not as bad, then there'll be a lot of people that'll plant extend beans, either because seed availability, the genetics are very good in them, and also out of self-defense because of not knowing what their neighbors are going to do. But they may well not spray them with Dicamba because they might be able to control their weeds with alternate herbicides. The east of Crowley's Ridge is where the huge resistant Palmer amaranth issue is, and when those guys plant extend technology, the only post-emergence herbicide option they have that's effective is to spray Dicamba.
Other questions? Okay, hearing no questions, I thank everybody for your time and attention, and I hope you will be on the lookout. If you have any additional questions, you can send them to me, and I will forward them on to Ford to help you out. And you'll be hearing from me later on with a link to this webinar. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thanks for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir,
Thank
thank you.